Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure meeting you, and it's a privilege to be talking to you all. I thought that, I'll share some of the perspectives that might be useful for us to consider as a nation, and also as an industry, the refining and the chemical industry, in terms of what we could possibly do. Hey, Sunny, do we have the presentation? Yeah, okay, great. So I think I thought what I'll talk about is, how do we look at really getting the advantage, refining advantage for India. And I call it refining advantage, India's refining advantage, rather than refining advantage of crude. And fundamentally, and I think people talked about it, it's got to do with how much value we create, how do we really architect resilience, which again drops onto security, for example, into the entire ecosystem of refining. And finally, I think, importantly, which Dr. Malhotra talked about, has got to do with carbon management and how we really look at practical pathways to carbon management, which makes sense. So I think working all these things together essentially gives you a perspective in terms of what might evolve going forward. So here are a couple of things that we kind of like talk about. One is that, it's not just about industry strategy. Yeah, sure it is. But importantly, it is also about how can refining and transformation become a national platform, given what we have seen geopolitically over the past few months and what's likely to again happen at some time in the future. So being able to create that form of a platform which gives you the resilience is, as a fundamental driver in terms of how you take forward our entire crude and crude conversion ecosystem into the future. So therefore, the question becomes, how do we make this reinforcing in a holistic manner, which allows you for energy resilience, which translates to security as one option. And so that has got a lot to do with what we call as optionality, right? And we'll talk a little bit of optionality. Optionality across different areas, the value chain. We talk about optionality in terms of crude basket, but there's optionality in the refining, assets. There's optionality in the demand side. The question becomes, how do I combine the options in the best possible way to create resilience? I think, and that again leads to how you expand the value basket. And we have heard a lot from different people, different nations who are pursuing expanding the value basket. China, for example, increasingly moving the value basket more towards molecules of quote-unquote higher value. There have been situations where they've overinvested, and we should be careful about that. But again, expanding crude's value from fuels to a larger basket becomes important for sustained operations and flexibility. And I think it's important to understand that GRM, as you all know, is a driver for refining operations. But we need to look at GRM from a longer-term structural perspective, and we call it structural GRM. And if you embed intelligence and optionality on how you harness optionality and intelligence, your GRM structure will change over time. And that's a very key indicator in terms of how we drive the industry's health and industry's prosperity and the nation's prosperity forward. And finally, I talk about it quite a bit, is how do we decarbonize? And decarbonization needs to consider economics. Decarbonization without economics, just green, doesn't work. So you got to have monetizable decarbonization in conjunction with the other three pillars that we talked about in terms of value creation, resilience, GRM lift, and expansion. And so how you decarbonize, how do you create margin-preserving pathways becomes very important in terms of looking at how you move forward in terms of the net zero path. And so value, resilience, GRM, and carbon management must be optimized together. So that's basically the message that I think is important to understand as we move forward. So here's, again, just a reiteration of what I talked about in terms of, from a fuel-heavy barrel moving to a higher value molecule basket, right? And so I think all of us know about this, just a reiteration that from crude to fuels or crude to value. And this has been the general theme. The question becomes, how much can we go at what speed and what makes sense? Today, probably 10 to 13% is in the higher quote-unquote value basket for India. China is about probably moving to 40, 50%, for example. The question becomes what makes sense for the nation, what makes sense for the industry to preserve value and move the basket from across the barrel stream, top barrel processing to middle barrel processing to bottom barrel processing. We do, for example, a lot less on bottom barrel processing right now, because the advantage that we get into the bottom barrel processing is not that much or not been quantified that way. So the question becomes, how do you balance that? And so there are different kinds of things that you can do in terms of value streams across the different baskets, from petrochemicals and aromatics down to syngas and H2DME, right? And so this optimization becomes a key driver of the industry, key driver of the strategy for the country and the nation. I would say that one of the things that we have been working on, and which I think finds a lot of traction, with quite a few people that we worked on outside and also starting to work out here, has got to do with, again, what I talk about is, you have to integrate intelligence across optionality. So if you look at the left side, I talked about the crude source portfolio. You've got different kinds of crudes that we have options and access to. We don't exercise all those options. We exercise a few, right? And that creates rigor and dependency and vulnerability. Question becomes, how do I exploit the different kinds of crude? For example, WCS Canada, right? And that's an option. The China exploits a lot. We probably can. The other what you call heavy crude options that we can exploit. Can we exploit to some degree US shale, right? And I think the question becomes, how do I look at the crude source portfolio in terms of security and contracts and markets to be able to assimilate the right composition if I have the right options for refining it, right? And so therefore, the optionality in refining becomes very important in terms of your asset base, which allows you to expand across a wide variety of crude portfolios based on economics, based on security, based on resilience, based on multiple factors which drive what you want to do. And then you are applying that to demand on the value basket, which stretches from, of course, fuels to what we call end values and petrochemicals and others. And I think this is an important piece because here is where intelligence becomes very important. And, people talk about artificial intelligence. A lot of it is fashion, I think. But the real application of intelligence is across the value chain on how do you harness the understanding of uncertainties and volatilities across different areas of the value chain and combine them together to create the most effective impact. And I think that is probably one of the biggest impact that our biggest areas that Indian refining, our refining can take advantage of as we move forward to not only create much more resilience and not only combine different kinds of options in a more effective manner, but I think more importantly, being able to really lift the GRMs and lift the operational flexibility and lift the margins much better compared to what it is today, because the fact of the matter is if you're able to harness massive amount of patterns and data across this different chain, the ability for you to make decisions more effectively becomes much, much more pronounced and much, much more effective, which gives you significant multiplier impact in terms of elevating what I call as the value pools, value pool margins across the different what I call barrel sets. And we think that intelligence essentially is fundamental in terms of converting optionality, all options that we have got, into value under constraints of operation, which is typical in any refinery. And I think that I kind of reiterate that a little bit more because a lot of people talk about this, but India is very well positioned. That there are three basically countries in the world which are well positioned in terms of refining, in terms of assets. The United States at about 18 million barrels of heavy complex refinery. China at about similar 18 million barrels. India is about 5.56. But the asset base is very optional and flexible, and that can be expanded. So which I think bodes very well for it to drive forward the value and drive forward the resilience that's required, in navigating the markets and the economy as we move forward. And I think that, finally, I'll just talk about a little bit about carbon management, is how it's important. And I think that we have different ways of managing carbon. At the biggest lever, I would still claim, and I will still believe, is efficiency. How we drive efficiency intelligently becomes more important given what we have. The second one, which I think like Dr. Malhotra talked about, has got to do with things around managing carbon, capturing carbon, transporting carbon, sequestering carbon, and converting carbon. And I must say that it's important to understand from a refinery complex perspective. We did I think the IOCL Koyali refinery carbon management, and I think BPCL also, we did something in carbon management. But the point out here is that how do we make carbon management margin preserving? So therefore, for example, if you look at some areas, it doesn't make sense to do carbon capture in refineries. If you look at the heaters, right, distillation heaters, for example, they're very expensive to take CO2 out and manage it because the multiple points of distribution is a problematic area. The FCCs, for example, is much better, right? I mean, cost of capture, cost of transportation is much better. Petco gasifiers, and that's again one of the optionality in the value chain that we have not exercised in India. We must, I think, to transform into value. If you do the bottom residues and use Petco gasifiers, if you look at the value created, is significant depending upon what you want to do. And I think that carbon management also is much easier because of the density of the carbon stream. So therefore, being able to identify how much carbon should I manage at what cost and what value it creates becomes fundamental in terms of driving your carbon architecture for a refinery. Heavy refineries or complex refineries typically have higher emissions, 40, 45, 50 kgs, depending upon the efficiency per barrel. And so we need to manage it. And again, I think the other thing, I keep on saying this, and we keep on saying to different institutions and customers around the world, is that we have to look at it from a economics, scale, and operations perspective. If I tell, Dr. Prabdas, for example, just to pick on you, that, hey, you know what, you got to put up this entire carbon capture infrastructure for you at $2 billion. And you got to operate it, you got to operate the zoning, you got to figure out the pipelines, you got to figure out the storage, you got to figure out the conversion, you got to figure out the capture technology. He'll say, you know what, I run a refinery, okay? And you tell me that you put this whole thing in, I don't know how I'm going to do that. Right? So there would be a lot of people who would be willing to, but mostly what we have seen, it's a different competency area, different investment set, and this reticence and obvious reluctance in terms of going forward. So one way to do that, which we have talked about, is that yes, you can have demonstration large-scale projects, which is financed by the announcement that happened in the union budget recently, but just like power utility, just like water utility, you must have carbon capture systems as a utility. So think about it as a regulated utility, where you've got a grid operator, grid utility operator, which installs a carbon capture system on your premises based on what makes most sense, hauls it off right on his zoning network, and then sequesters that into the right place in terms of storage or converts that. So that will create scale, that will create value in terms of cost, and that'll really create a mechanism which allows the implementation to happen much faster. So I think, so CCUS will scale when it moves from projects to regulated utility, and I think that's an impetus that we need to drive forward in India as a part of the policy that we framed. We thought that will be a useful thing to do, and I think hopefully that moves forward. So I think in the end, capture systems, carbon management has got to preserve margin, has got to create value, has got to be able to translate into products, if possible, in the right economics. And I think the fact of the matter is that we need to be able to store and sequester carbon, because that's the most effective way of disposing carbon dioxide. So having said that, I'll just kind of end with saying that for India, I think given the base that we have got in terms of the refining ecosystem, we're probably very advantaged, Not many people recognize that. I think they're very advantaged compared to Europeans, for example. And I think the next refining advantage will really belong to systems that combine what I talked about, this optionalities across crude optionality, refining asset optionality, demand optionality, combining that together with the intelligence that's evolving, right? And we've seen a lot of these things happening over the past 3 years, and it'll just leapfrog forward, and combine that with the right kind of carbon management to be able to create a very prosperous ecosystem for the industry as well as a very prosperous nation going forward. Thank you very much.